I was speaking earlier with Maria Tolero,
Right.
who's a philosopher.
Yes.
And I mentioned John Dewey, who's a philosopher,
Right.
who said democracy begins in conversation.
Aha.
And I wanted to thank you both for taking a moment after the lecture and the Q&A to take a few more moments to talk about what was discussed tonight and your organizations. And I thought maybe Harriet, since Denver Justice and Peace Committee was the sponsoring organizing group, maybe you could talk about that and a little bit about yourself and your role in it.
Okay. Well, the Denver Justice and Peace Committee is an organization that's a little over 30 years, and our focus has always been on Latin America, and our goal is to see that human rights and economic justice are brought to Latin America with the hope of lasting peace, and we do our work through solidarity projects, nonviolent activism, educational programs, such as doing things like bringing this Salon program and Brigetta to Denver and to our work. Actually was one of the people who started the Salon program a few years ago, and have been active in the advocacy committee and on the board, and writing things for the organization and doing things like this. So,
Fantastic.
yeah, so we were very happy that it worked out that while Brigetta was in the States for a month, that she was able to come and join us. Last year we had Graham Russell from Rights Action was here, who got us very interested in Honduras, and earlier in the year a number of us participated in the Rights Action delegation, so we're familiar with many of the issues and the places that Brigetta was talking about this evening.
And years ago, I think it was one of your events, an awards ceremony, and you brought Jennifer Harberry.
Yes, Jennifer Harberry, right, yeah, we've been able every year to honor some international organization that with our Global Peacemaker Award, and Jennifer was recognized. And last year, Rights Action was.
These get-togethers have been such an education for me, and tonight as well. The depth of your knowledge about Honduras and going down there and sharing your story. And I was wondering, real quick, if you could talk a little bit about your journey to Honduras and the social justice issues going on there.
Sure. So I'm an activante with School of the Americas Watch in Honduras, which I've actually been there for a little over a year now. And the School of the Americas Watch is working to close the U.S. Army School of the Americas, which is a military training facility for Latin American soldiers, Latin American military officers more than anything. And several of the military folks who carried out the 2009 coup in Honduras were trained here in the U.S. at the School of the Americas. And so part of my role is to document what is happening in Honduras in the post-coup situation and the human rights abuses that are happening. And we see many cases of people who have been murdered, who are receiving death threats, who are being surveilled, who are being followed, being threatened by armed gunmen. And especially looking at the connections between U.S. military funding and what is happening and the repression that the Honduran people are facing. And so that is part of my work there, and I was talking a little bit tonight about some of the cases that we have seen and some of the struggles that are happening, especially in areas of the country like the lower Aguan Valley, where over 100 campesinos or small farmers have been murdered since the coup. And we were able to look at some of the pictures from an exhumation that appeared where actually, somebody who had disappeared a year earlier had been buried in a clandestine grave and then was finally exhumed, and they were able to figure out who he was, because he's not the only person who has disappeared in that area. And also looking at situations like what's happening right now to the Lenca people in Rio Blanco, where the military has been deployed and the police have been deployed to intimidate and threaten the people into allowing a hydroelectric dam to be built. Some of the other issues that we talked about related to upcoming elections in Honduras and the need for there not to be U.S. Intervention in the elections, for them to be fair elections. Many people are afraid there will be fraudulent elections. There's been a new political party created in Honduras, Libre, and Xiomara Castro, the wife of President Zelaya, who was ousted in the coup, is the candidate, and all throughout the summer has been leading in the polls and has tremendous support among the Honduran populace. But the favored candidate of the powerful is the current president of the National Congress. And so as the elections have been getting closer, the repression has been intensifying in Honduras, especially basically so many people face repression, journalists, lawyers, and also now candidates and activists with the Libre Party, people who are standing up and refusing to be kicked off of their land throughout the country. The Lenca people in Rio Blanco have been facing intense repression, actually, and right now there's a situation where a judge has actually ordered Berta Cáceres, the coordinator of the Lenca organization COPIN, to be jailed while awaiting trial for bogus charges aimed at silencing her and silencing the Lenca people from speaking up against this hydroelectric dam project in Rio Blanco. And there are 3 people who are facing charges, Berta Cáceres, Aureliano Molina, and Tomas Gomez. And one of the things that people can do, which we talked about, is to contact your congresspeople, your senators, ask them to contact the U.S. Embassy in Honduras to speak out against the criminalization of the leaders of COPIN and of other social movement leaders in Honduras, because it's a trend that is increasing, where people who are leaders of organizations or working for justice are being criminalized, in addition to being threatened and to being followed and to being surveilled and to having so many of them murdered. So.
And you were discussing the initial coup, and that was against President
Zelaya.
So Zelaya.
And some of the factors you mentioned that may have prompted that, he wanted a moratorium on mining.
So in 2009, in June of 2009, President Zelaya was forcibly removed by military officials and flown out of the country in his pajamas. And there are a number of economic reasons behind the coup. Zelaya had done many things that social movements had been asking for a long time. He had raised the minimum wage, had put a moratorium on mining. In Honduras, there's open pit mining for gold, which is extremely destructive and uses cyanide and other heavy metals that poison people and poison the river that people drink. And so Zelaya had also agreed to have a referendum to ask the population if they wanted to put a question on the next ballot about having a constituent assembly to reform the Constitution. And it was on the day of that referendum, or the nighttime, that the early morning hours, the early morning hours of that day of the referendum, that Zelaya was forcibly removed from the country, prompting, so many people from throughout Honduras to go into the streets and to demand the return of their democratically elected president. And people were in the streets day after day facing military repression, facing police repression, and refused to leave. The resistance movement in Honduras is incredibly strong, and so many people continue to stand up day in and day out and to say, no, we want to have our basic rights respected. We want to have a country that we can determine the direction of and where everybody has rights. And so that's what's at stake now in the elections, where we see a new political party that has been formed out of the resistance movement, and everybody's kind of looking towards November 24th to see what happens.
So much to learn about U.S. foreign policy and the military involvement, U.S. influence in elections. You mentioned they're sending voting machines from the U.S. for the upcoming election. I was wondering if you could speak to the connections, not just U.S., but you mentioned Canada as well, and other industrialized alleged democracies. The economics underlying a lot of this is this part of the neoliberalism, the privatization goals of the kind of corporate aristocracy.
So many of the mining companies in Honduras and elsewhere are Canadian mining companies. So Goldcorp, for instance, is the company that has the San Martin mine in the Syria Valley in Honduras. And there's a lot of economic interests in Honduras, not only mining, hydroelectric dams, land for plantation-style agriculture, resources, so many different natural resources. And so
ecotourism.
Yeah, there's model cities as well. That's another issue that has come up. And so currently what's happening is so many of the resources are being privatized rapidly and sold off to corporations for exploitation, and so there is a large vested interest for multinational corporations in continuing this trend, and what we see is that it is being enforced by the military. And the U.S. continues to provide millions in military aid to Honduras, despite the fact that we see the military being deployed in the lower Oguan Valley. We see the military being deployed in Rio Blanco, where just on July 15th, a soldier, point blank, just from a few feet away, shot multiple times and murdered Tomas Garcia, an indigenous Lenca leader, and injured his 17-year-old son in front of 200 people. And so the military there's been numerous human rights abuses that have been documented, and yet the U.S. continues to fund the Honduran military and police. And so many organizations and people are calling for the U.S. to cut military and police aid to Honduras, and that's something that's really important. If people contact their senators and representatives and say you want them to close the School of the Americas, to stop training these people, and to cut military and police aid to Honduras.
Well, so much of what you both have been talking about and what such important grassroots organizations like DJPC has been talking about is very remote to the awareness of a lot of people here in the U.S., here in the Empire.
One of the biggest problems.
Yes, that Simon Bolivar talked about. That was up to no good in a lot of ways. But to catch up on this information, to get some of the political, historical context, I was wondering if you could recommend what are some of the resources that have helped you find your way through the either no information or disinformation that we're so exposed to?
Well, part of it is my own academic study. I did a graduate degree somewhat recently that, included things like this, and travel, belonging to organizations like DJPC. And one of the things about the, internet is that it does open a lot of resources. And I think, too, organizations like the project that Brigitte was working on this year, the Stories from Honduras, if you go to that page on SOA Watch's website, there's a whole list of articles and stories. Rights Action, the organization that we honored last year and with whom many of us traveled, they have videos, they have many articles that are available, and those are just, I think, maybe two of the primary ones. But unfortunately, they don't go to the mainstream press. And it was mentioned tonight that even the alternative press in the U.S. isn't covering issues like this very much. I mean, I think a show like Democracy Now! Probably will when we get closer to the election, but all these daily events aren't very well reported. I mean, there are things like the Honduran Solidarity Network, and if you subscribe to them, you're getting at least 10 or 12 emails a day about things that are going on. But it isn't common knowledge. It's far away and remote, and the Banana Republic, named by O. Henry, a little known fact that I discovered recently.
I guess I would like to kind of correct myself a little bit. I think public consciousness is a little broader in some ways than we might imagine. For instance, John Perkins wrote a book very much connected to these issues of economic exploitation. His Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Yeah.
That was on the bestseller list for months. And
and I think you make a good point, because there are a lot of things that are written about many of these countries, and I've noticed Brigitte's favorite words is emblematic. And it's sort of, sometimes you feel like, I can just do a global search and replace. Different country name, maybe a different industry, maybe a different this, that, or the other thing, but the dynamic is the same. And if we look at the U.S. role, it traces right back to the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah.
And then there was the Roosevelt Corollary.
Yeah.
And then, recently John Kerry was saying Latin America's our backyard.
And the Roman Empire was...
Yeah, I mean, to say history repeats itself is sort of a trite statement at some point.
I think Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah.
And
On the resource question, just to say some of those websites for people. So if, on the School of the Americas Watch website, it's www.soaw.org, and then if you put a slash the word Honduras, that's where all the stories from Honduras are posted, and so people can find them. Harriet also mentioned Rights Action. Their website is www.rightsaction.org. There's also, you can look up the Honduras Solidarity Network. There's a number of organizations that are posting a lot about Honduras and posting it regularly. So there is a lot available on the internet.
Yeah.
There's a lot of resources for people that are out there. And this November with the elections coming up, I think there's going to be even more information that people are going to be putting on the internet, a lot of organizations that are monitoring this. And the School of the Americas Watch Vigil in Fort Benning, the mobilization outside the gates of the Western Hemispheric Institute for Security Cooperation, as it's now named, is actually the same weekend as the elections. And so for people who are going to that, there's going to be a lot of updates as well as on the elections. And it's important to realize that this is all stuff that's happening today. All these human rights abuses are happening as we speak and are being carried out and are being committed. And so it's really important that people learn more and take action.
I agree.
One other online resource is there's an online journal, Upside Down World, and it focuses on all the countries of Latin America, and they have a quick little thing, usually on the right-hand side, a column where you go to a country and you can pull up all the articles that they've written on that particular country.
Yeah.
So that's real helpful.
And I wanted to say, the kind of dismaying parts of history do repeat themselves, like the empires and war and whatnot, but the resistance repeats itself too.
Exactly.
And it's really warms my heart to see they've discovered the good work that's going on in the world. And one last question. Well, I did want to plug something myself. You're probably both familiar with the journal NACLA.
Yes. Another excellent.
Yes. And a film by John Pilger called The War on Democracy, which covers U.S. involvement in various countries. But again, the resistance, which is so amazing. And I wonder if you both, for the final question, if you could, I read a book about Guatemalan resistance, and it was sort of a brutal attack. It was an absolutely brutal attack against them, but they still are there. And Rigoberto Menchú is there in a big way. And the book about this movement was called Our Culture is Our Resistance. And I was wondering if that brought anything
By
to your mind.
Jonathan Muller,
Yes.
a member of DJPC.
Okay, excellent.
It's one of 2 books that he has written on Guatemala, yes.
I remember that now.
Yes.
Well, speaking of culture as resistance, what comes to your minds when you, or your hearts when you hear that phrase? Have you seen examples of that in your travels or here in the U.S.?
I think in Honduras right now, the resistance movement is such a big part of the reality and of the culture and of everything. I think the coup really made things so plain to so many people in the country. And so the resistance movement is extremely strong, and it's something that people are willing to stand up knowing that they could be killed, receive death threats, and they refuse to be quiet. They continue to speak out. And the level of commitment is just something that is so intense and so unparalleled, where that's what makes the resistance movement so strong, because people are risking so much to work for human rights, to work for fairness, and to create the country that they want to create, a sovereign country where they have the right to elect presidents and where people have all sorts of rights to their land and have the right to a fair wage. And I think it permeates everything in Honduras right now. So.
You were mentioning campesinos. Part of the resistance here and there is the culture, the art, the music. I found actually a rap musician named Akil Amar, and he's been called like the Tupac of Mexico. He has a song about campesinos, and so there's interesting efforts like that.
And I think you
as well.
find that, everywhere, both as resistance, certainly art and music, dance in El Salvador and Guatemala in the wake of the war, in terms of trying to come to some kind of transition to justice, that's a mechanism that is used. I think that, you're talking earlier about, people don't have so many things. The only alternative is to fight. And there's such strength and unity when a community comes together and does that. And, if you read history, so many groups have done that, throughout. And there's something innate in the human spirit, I believe, that knows there is something better and is willing to go for it, as we say. And that when you do that together with people, there's such unity and there's strength. And then there's that joy that I mentioned earlier during the questions, that people can have in the midst of all this strife. It's just amazing.
They've lived something better for so long, and this will be the last question for sure. When you were in Honduras, in this very fertile valley, you said you felt something like being Alice in Wonderland, with the trees and the fruits and the vegetables, and so they're preserving that. And tell me more about that incredible way of life that they had.
Yeah, I think you're referring to one of the Lenca communities, Rio Blanco, and people have their own way of life. They live off of the soil. It's very different. So I think it's hard for us in the United States to imagine, living off of growing your own corn, your own beans, oranges, bananas, plantains, yucca, coffee. They grow so many different crops, and they have really stewarded their forests. They have stewarded the rivers. They've really taken care of the land, and it is where their life comes from, and it's how they feed their families, and it's how they feed their children. And they have a dignified life, or they had before the dam company came, and now that is part of the reason that they aren't giving up. And since April 1st, every single day, they are out there preventing the dam from moving forward and facing the military and their guns, and facing the armed hitmen, and facing the death threats and the shots that are fired as they walk by. And they're fighting for their way of life. They're fighting for their right to live with dignity, and to live, to support their children, to feed their children, and to have water to drink, and to be who they are.
I think another part of that, though, is indigenous communities everywhere have a different relationship to land than we as white Anglo-Saxons have. And it's very hard for us to understand that. I mean, I have a garden. I love it. It is mine. I cherish it. There's nowhere near the type of real relationship as part of who they are as people, their identity, their souls. It's just not the same. So it's really a culture clash when we see these corporate entities come in with total disregard for that. I mean, they're like, oh, sure, I'm taking out the guy's field, but he has no idea that he's also taking out part of that man's soul.